Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest-running hiking podcast, downloaded over 1 million times worldwide and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country.
In today's episode 295, we catch up with adventurer James McAlloon to find out about his latest epic adventure, Crossing Greenland. We hope you enjoy. Before we get into today's episode, if you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the supporters page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. In episode 231, titled Crossing the Tanami, we interviewed adventurer James McAlloon just as he was about to set off on the final leg of a unique adventure across Australia. This would take him 1,745 kilometres from Alice Springs through to Broome, crossing the Tanami Desert in the process. In today's episode, we catch back up with James about his latest adventure as he and his adventure partner, Henk Morgans, cross Greenland. And believe it or not, this is a warm-up to a bigger adventure, which we'll discuss at the end of this episode. James, thank you for taking the time to chat with Australian Hiker about your unique journey.
Oh, thanks so much, Tim. Thanks for having me on. I'm very excited to talk a little bit more about it now that I'm back on home soil.
For those long-time listeners of Australian Hiker, they may remember you from episode 231 when you walked across the Central Australian Tanami Desert. I would expect Greenland to be a totally different experience. Before we get on to that, give us a brief introduction to yourself, your general background and your involvement in the hiking and adventure activities.
Yeah, okay. My name is James McAlloon, and I'm a Queenslander, born and raised in Gympie, but spent most of my adult life overseas. And I suppose I've just always been into the outdoors. I grew up on a farm, basically had parents that didn't want us in the house ever, grew up with brothers. So naturally, if you weren't working or at school, you'd be camping, you'd be running around in creeks, you'd be building things out of sticks, and everything like that. And so that kind of creates, as a child, a love for the outdoors and a bit of adventure and an imagination. And so as I got older, I got into, more and more sports, more and more hiking, camping. That emerged into climbing and it just kind of escalates from there. That turned into bigger trips, rock climbing, mountaineering, moving to South America. And I've been back in Australia for 7 years now. And every trip seems to get bigger and bigger. So that's kind of my background in terms of, the love of the outdoors and what I'm doing in my spare time to just get out of the office and embrace that as much as possible.
Now, are you still working in the outdoor industry as well, or have you shifted jobs since last time?
No, still at the same job. I work for a Antarctic and South American tourism company that, operates trips to South America and ships down to Antarctica. So I've been there for 6 years now and, love it. Yeah, they're very supportive of my lifestyle, so it's a bit hard to leave. Especially when you need the flexibility with doing big trips.
No, that's fair enough. Okay, so now let's get on to your Greenland crossing. How did this trip come about and what was the aim of the trip?
Yeah, so it was a big trip, but it was pretty unexpected. We've been, and when I say we, expedition partner and I that I met a few years ago, where we've been aiming to do this expedition in Antarctica that I've always wanted to do. And most of the trips that I've done in the past have been, pretty simple in terms of, I want to do it. Okay, so you figure out how much it costs, what you need to go do, and then you go and do it. with this being such a massive trip in such a remote and extreme area, we pretty much had to start from the bottom and learn everything we needed to do. We needed to learn how to ski. We needed to learn how to survive in the cold winters. We needed to learn how to navigate in whiteouts, and learn all the equipment. And it was it was almost a university degree in terms of educating yourself in Antarctic and polar travel. And Greenland really was the first test of all of that education. And so we never really expected to go, but we realised we needed a way of testing our skills and testing what we'd learned, and also just putting ourselves out there. And Greenland was this fantastic opportunity to do a real committing expedition, but also something that prepared us for something even bigger. And so we really only started looking at it with a couple months to go, and then it was just a matter of figuring it all out, getting the permits, mapping it, talking to some experts, and away we went.
Now that raises a question. I'm glad you did mention it. What are the permit requirements? Can you just land in Greenland and start wandering across the frozen wastelands, or do you actually need a specific permit and that details where you're going to be and what you're doing?
Yeah, it's quite fascinating, actually. I didn't expect it to be so bureaucratic. You could, but not that I would ever encourage this, literally fly in and just do that, but that's very illegal. So, yeah, there's a huge permitting process. And it's all done through the Greenland Danish government, because Greenland is a territory of Denmark. And basically it's because it's such an extreme place that they want to make sure that nobody's going up there that doesn't have the experience or is going to put themselves in danger, which then stresses the emergency services. So you have to apply directly to a department of the government. You have to fill in all these permits. You have to pay a fee. And then in addition to that, you need a bank guarantee, which is a very old school way of basically guaranteeing the funds for an emergency should you need rescuing. And you also need evacuation and rescue insurance. You need all of these things. So I didn't expect it to be that bureaucratic, but it really was. And then, but rightfully so, and it took a couple of months, but once you got the tick of approval, it was pretty clear pathway.
Okay, yeah, I just hadn't thought of that. I can think of it. You think about some areas, and I think even people who have done the Australian Alps walking track in the middle of winter, apparently you have to have an in-depth conversation with the police and convince them you've got the experience, just so if they have to come and rescue you, it's something really wrong, not just because you've got no idea what you're doing. So I think it's not unreasonable, I suppose, because I'm guessing it's probably a fairly expensive process if they've got to come in and drag you out of where you happen to be.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're going with a guided group, obviously you don't have to deal with that personally, but the company that's guiding you does still have to go through that entire process. And because we wanted to do it unguided, unsupported, we just wanted to go and do it by ourselves and see if we could do it. We were responsible for all of that, those bureaucratic steps and those permits. So it was quite enlightening to the process of it. But like you say, we understand why those are in place and the importance of it. And we actually did talk to a couple of people that needed rescuing, and it's really expensive because it's so remote. The only access to quickly is via helicopter. And, if you're aware of helicopters, they've only got a certain range. And so for these guys in particular, they had to helicopter in fuel to a depot, establish a depot, and go back, get more fuel, go to the depot, fuel up, pick the people up and all their gear, go back to the depot, go back, go drop them off, and then refuel again, go pick up the things at the depot, fuel it back. And so it's just extremely expensive exercise. And rightfully, the government wants to make sure that anybody that's endeavouring on something like this, except for exceptional circumstances, has the experience to look after themselves.
Now, something I hadn't thought of, is there a route across Greenland? Is it something that everybody does, or you've got a number of options and you basically pick one?
There are a few options. I guess it depends on what you're doing and if you're going on a guided trip or not. The most common one is west to east or east to west ski, and that is a pretty common route, and it's a route that we took going west to east. But there are other routes there, and ultimately you could also decide on your own route if you worked out the logistics. Because 95% of Greenland is just one big ice cap. So it's not like there's barriers in your way if you decide that you want to go this way or that way or this way or that. It's more of, the one route in particular just sees most of the traffic because that's the classic Greenland ski crossing. But for example, there's the Nansen route, which kind of follows half of the classic route and then goes down to a different area. There's people that have skied north to south and south to north, so it's really a combination of everything. But there's not too many limits as long as you've got an entry point and exit point. Then you, as far as I'm aware, you can pretty much go anywhere you like.
Okay. So tell us a bit about the trail. I mean, the route that you chose, was it the shortest route, or what was the distance you actually covered?
So it is the classic route for a Greenland ice cap crossing, and in the spring, most of them go west to east, and then in the autumn, it's east to west, and that has a lot to do with the ice melt and the wind more than anything, just because you want to, make it as easy as possible for you. Yeah. But it's still about 600 kilometres, so it's not a walk in the park. It still is a dedicated 3 to 5 week expedition. We were quite fortunate actually because we went west to east, and so our starting point was a point called point 660, which is only a few kilometres up the road from Kangerlussuaq, and Kangerlussuaq is the only international runway in the entire subcontinent. And so starting out was quite simple because we literally just flew in, stayed the night, sorted our gear, got a lift up to the ice cap and just started our journey. But it does take you to the east coast, which is much, much more remote. And there's only tiny little settlements there that are serviced by helicopters, and for about 1 to 2 months a year when the ice melts enough, then cargo ships can come and service them as well. So on the classic route, we went to the east coast, and a lot of people take a helicopter from the end. We wanted to do it cheaply, so we decided to ski down the icefall and across the frozen fjord to the tiny settlement of Isotok, where they had a once-a-week carrier helicopter for just community members. So that's what we decided to do.
Okay.
But that's the main route, anyway. So really your two options on the east coast would be to get picked up by a chartered helicopter at the end of the ice cap, or descend down the glacier and find your way to that settlement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, in relation to trail tread, I must admit I didn't have a picture of what Greenland looked like. I realised there was glacier and snow there, but I wasn't too sure if it was a lot of rocky areas. So were you pretty much on snow all the way through, or did you have some rock crossings as well?
Yeah, no, it's the largest ice cap in the world outside of Antarctica or the Arctic. So essentially it's, for example, for our crossing, it's not even the widest point, and it's 600 kilometres, and it's on the west coast. They've got more green areas, which is why it's called Greenland, by the way. But it's only about, from the ocean to the start of the ice cap, about 40 kilometres, and then that's where we started. And going up at the very start, it was a bit rocky, and then you have to ascend the ice cap, which is basically going up at 20 degrees, basically up frozen water, essentially, and navigating through these frozen rivers until you get on top of the ice cap. And the ice cap, and it's, then once you're on top, it's essentially just flat and white and hard-packed snow for as far as the eye can see every single day until you get to the other side. So there is rockiness, but on our trip, because we started at the edge of the ice cap, we really didn't face that much of it. The main concerns for us were crevasses and and meltwater, but fortunately it was still frozen at that time. So it is literally ice and snow for the entire trip. I think at the summit, which is the center of the ice cap, we're at 2,600 meters above sea level, and most of that was ice. So it's just immense. It's just this complete winter wonderland, basically.
Okay.
Very different from Australia.
Yes,
for sure.
I think it is. Now, what about the logistical processes? So we've talked about the permitting, but what was involved? Did you carry everything with you as far as food, or did you get drop-offs? Or
no, we wanted to do it fully unsupported, and that basically means that you carry everything with you that you'll need for the entire trip, the entire time. One, because just an ethos of us wanting to be self-reliant, but then, also it's a lot cheaper. So everything that we needed except some food that you could find at a normal shop, we took with us. Being a really remote place, you really can't rely on getting everything that you always want, and a lot of our gear is quite specialised. So over the last couple of years, we've been, visiting Norway and getting specialised made gear for this kind of thing. So skis and boots and sleds and tents and freeze-dried foods and stoves and all of these things that we need to basically live out there for 3 weeks. And essentially we just need to source that from wherever we can, which in Australia means usually it's coming from the US or Norway or New Zealand. And then most of it we had with us before we left, and we just packaged it all up and took it with us. So the only thing that was missing was our sled, which we'd spent the last year being custom built for future trips. And because that was made in Norway, it was pretty easy for us to fly to Norway before going over to Greenland and just picking it up on the way.
Okay. Now, what about time expectations? You said this is typically about a 3 to 5 week trip. Is the 3 to 5 weeks more about individual fitness of the people who are taking part, or is it weather based, or a bit of both?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. It really depends on, I guess, your own level of experience and fitness, and also that of the group. If you're with the group, then obviously the pace depends on, the slowest people of the group and the logistics related to that. And obviously the pace of the guide and the snow conditions, and the weather can be really bad. Like you might even be doing really fast time, but then a storm comes and it's so severe that you have to bunker down for a week. So you really have to kind of plan according to both your fitness level, the snow conditions, and also be a bit conservative so that you've got extra in case, you get stuck in a storm or something like that. So for us, for example, we thought we'd do quite well. So we estimated that we would take about 25 days, but we took 28 days worth of food, so that way we had a little extra just in case, because essentially if you run out of food, then your expedition's done and you need to call a rescue helicopter.
Yep.
which is an expensive reason not to carry an extra kilo of food. So, but it also is a calculation, because the more food you take, the more your sled weighs, which is harder to pull, which makes you slower. So you got to really find this balance between, I think it's going to take 25 days, for example. I'll take 28. Every day you eat about a kilo of food and you use about 200 mils of fuel. So that means I'm going to have 30 kilograms of food and fuel. So if I plan for 5 weeks, well, then it's going to be 50 kilos. If I plan for 10 days, it's going to be 10 kilos. And that has a big impact on your pace as well. We were actually quite lucky, because we got stuck with really bad conditions, but we were fortunate enough to be faster than we expected, and I think we finished in 20 days, maybe 21 days, which was I think it was the fastest time for an Australian unsupported trip. But part of the reason for that was we were going at a 24-day pace, But then we realised that the once-a-week helicopter, we were only 1 day behind its scheduled departure, and we figured, if we do work really hard, and maybe we can take that helicopter and not be stuck in the middle of nowhere for a week.
Yeah.
So we pushed really hard the last few days and really kind of wore ourselves out, but we ended up tucking into those reserves for extra fuel and also to lighten the load, and it worked out, and we were able to make up time and finish way faster than we expected.
I was going to say I know at the start of the trip you're likely to have fresh legs and be doing well then, but you've got the heaviest load. The end of the trip, you're tired from the trip, but you're carrying the lightest load in the last few days.
Yeah, it's a weird mix, hey, because you're right, at the start, we're going uphill, even though you couldn't really tell, it's 1 or 2%, but it does make an impact. We had more snow and we had headwinds and the sled was heavy. So we were really strong, but it was so much work to keep pace, and one person would break trail and then we'd swap leads, and we'd do everything we could. We'd ski off course for a little bit so that we weren't walking into the wind, a bit like you do when you sail, I suppose, same kind of reasons, and then we'd swap and go the other way. So it made us faster and made it easier, but it also meant you were travelling further to go the same distance. And then we got stuck in a storm for 3 days. But that was almost a blessing in disguise, because we'd pushed so hard, even though we were forced into a tent and we were making no progress, it allowed us to rest and recover. And then when the storm passed, we were near the halfway mark and the snow got a lot better, and it was easier to ski on, and we got over the summit, and so we weren't going up anymore, and the wind was at our back. And so it was a combination of blessings of all these things, because we were really tired at the end, but everything else worked in our favour, so we still were able to do really good distances. And the first half, we were averaging about 24 to 26 kilometres a day, and the last half we were above 30. So,
okay.
It makes it's so many different factors, but ultimately you just try to be as efficient as possible.
So the last half was also downhill on average?
Yeah, but you can't really tell. So, because you're going from sea to sea, right? So, and then the middle is at 2,400 meters. So,
okay,
you're going up quite a long ways, but that's over the course of 600 kilometers. And so, for example, from the summit to the second last day went from 2,400 to 1,400. So you couldn't really tell that you were going downhill, but it would have made a big impact, because you technically still are. But then that last day we went within 40 kilometres, we went from 1,400 metres down to 0. Yeah. So that was the only day where we're like, we're going downhill. This is so much fun. The rest of it we had to work for.
Actually, that raises a question. So if you're on skis and you've got ski poles and you've got this thing that's following behind, what happens to the sled when you're going down a hill? Does it try and run you over?
I've got video of us sitting on it and riding it down the hill. So yeah, no, you do learn techniques of so you hold it like you would short leash a dog when you're teaching him to heel when you're walking. So it's right up next to your leg, and then you use the leg that's against the sled to push it to the right direction, and then you ski down with it that way. Or you just take your skis off and sit on it, which is what we did. It's so much more fun.
Yeah. Now, gear requirements, and I know that there's going to be differences based on climate. Pretty much was what you were using pretty much full-on snow gear, or did you have any standard gear that many hikers would be familiar with? Yeah,
probably a mix of both. It's a little counterintuitive, because even though most of the time it was down to minus 20, the only things we didn't wear any down, we didn't wear any insulation whatsoever whilst we were skiing. And the big thing with that, if anybody's been to the cold before, is you want to try and avoid sweating, because sweating puts essentially water on your skin, and that can cause you to freeze a lot faster. And so we had a merino, like a thermal layer, which everybody in cold weather wears. And then we had full windproof, like head to toe was fully windproof. Because it's so windy, it's really the wind that is the thing that causes the frostbite and very serious conditions in the extreme cold. But because you're working so hard, your body's generating that body heat anyway. And so really it's about moisture control and blocking the wind from touching your skin. And so we would have, we had integrated gaiters into our ski boots, which then was overlaid by a bib and brace that would go from our ankles up to our chest. And then we had a full-length hard shell jacket that would go from our hips all the way up to a hood. And then we had windproof gloves that would go all the way up to our elbows. So really we were making sure that the freezing wind didn't get to us whatsoever. But then it's about moisture control too. So our gloves, there were 3 layers. One was a liner glove, and then there was a kind of insulating glove, and then the windproofing, and you would just constantly adjust and aerate and zip up depending on how the wind was going and how cold it was. And then once you got into your tent and you weren't, exercising anymore, that's when you'd put on your down, or you'd get into your down sleeping bag. And so a lot of it's similar, like it's just more so. So down jacket, down snow pants, windproof hard shell jacket. The only difference with that is we've sewn in a fur in the hood, because that creates a microclimate to protect your face from the wind. The tent is a hell sport tent that's specifically designed for the polar regions as opposed to the mountain regions. But your sleeping system's the same. So you would just have a Z mat. You would have insulated closed cell, not insulated, sorry, like a closed cell inflatable air mat and a down sleeping bag, just -20 instead of -5. We also had like a Pertex outer layer just for moisture control once again. From our own body heat. But so apart from taking the cold and the wind into consideration, a lot of the systems is what you'd use on hiking and mountain sports.
Okay, so that brings us to weather. I mean, I suppose one thing it raises, or one thing I think about, is this is almost up to the Arctic Circle at this stage. You're in the summertime or the warmer months. So what was the daylight hours for your trip?
All the time. It really was. If in the Arctic and Antarctic circles, it's 24-hour daylight nearly during the summer times. We were there at the very start of the season in mid-spring. So we started in mid-April and finished in early May. So we kind of were in that transition, and we started above the Arctic Circle and we finished just below it, but still in the same region. And when we started, there was about maybe 5 to 6 hours of, I guess, what you'd call nighttime. It never really got fully dark, and then at the end there was only about 2 hours. And really the sun would go in this kind of elliptical, almost circle, and at night time it would dip just under the horizon, get kind of dusky for a couple of hours, and then come back up. And so in a lot of ways it was quite good because it was going in such a wide circle. We could use it as a navigation tool because of its shadow kind of made like a 10 on a clock, so to speak. But yeah, it made it great because we didn't have to pack anything for nighttime. So we didn't need head torches. We didn't need anything like that. But to go to sleep, you had to cover your eyes, and usually it just meant that you put your beanie over your eyes, so that way it was just easier to fall asleep and make it a bit darker for you.
Okay.
Oh, I was just going to say, but it does trip you out. So when we're doing that, we're trying to stick to a schedule. So we need to make sure that we're watching our watch, because you wouldn't even know that it's 11 o'clock at night just because it's so light.
So what time of the day did you typically start, and what time did you finish?
Yeah, so rest was more important to us than anything else. So we kind of catered our day based on making sure that we got enough rest. which is it might sound counterintuitive, but ultimately, you can really only push yourself for one day. But if you're going out for 3 weeks, then you need to make sure that you're recovering properly. And so we would make sure that we always had 10 hours of sleep, or at least try to get 10 hours of sleep. And then we would ski. We'd probably wake up between 5:30 and 6. You'd have to boil water, so that way you had water for the day and you could cook your breakfast because everything was freeze-dried. And that would take about an hour to an hour and a half. So there was always one person in charge of cooking and the other person pretty much did everything else. And so whilst you were boiling your water, you would, go to the toilet, you would do your check-ins, you would basically get ready for the day. And then one of the last things you'd do is you'd eat the food and then you would pack up. And we'd try and get started between 7 and 7:30 in the morning. And that would go in hour-and-a-half stints all the way through till maybe 6. And then we would, set up again, because it would take maybe 10 minutes to set up the tent, take 2 hours to boil water and eat your food and rest and relax. And then at night time, before we went to bed, is when we did everything. So if something had to be fixed, we'd fix that. We would do our check-ins. We would get weather updates. We would do any kind of blogging or charging that we needed to do. Because it was kind of our rest and relax time, this in the morning was more about efficiently trying to get started so that we could ski for about 12 hours and then rest for about, 14 hours.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So did you have any extreme weather at all, or was it pretty much good weather, or you had a bit of a mix of both?
For both, I would say more bad weather than good weather. So we were quite lucky because the first few days we were making our way up through the labyrinth of ice melts up to the glacier, and it's quite tricky to navigate. And it was clear as, so it was really good. But the first day that we were actually on the ice cap where it was flat and it was safe, it was a complete whiteout. And over the 21 days, we had 9 days of complete whiteout, which is basically in every direction you look, you can't see further than maybe 10 meters. It's just like being inside a ping pong ball. So, I mean, it doesn't mean that the weather's particularly bad, but having to navigate through that's quite difficult and quite draining. And it throws your equilibrium off, and you have to be really attention based on your compass to make sure you're not going the wrong way without realizing it. So we had a lot of those, and then we had a lot of headwinds. Most of it we could ski through, but at one point, there's one point particularly along the route that's a bit of a highlight. It's called Die 2. It's an old kind of Cold War research base that's been abandoned for a long time, but the Americans still use the runway to practice for Antarctica. And that's kind of the point where you go from southeast to east. And it's just a cool point to get to, and we're so excited to get there. But we got about 15 kilometres away, and the wind got so bad that we had to hunker down in our tent for 2 nights and 3 days. And I think the wind got to 170 kilometres an hour. It was just insane. But there was nothing we could do, and then the day we ended up skiing to the base, it was still 70 knot wind, kilometre an hour winds, most of it headwinds. It was just, there were some really tough conditions. But then on the days that it was pristine, we were just elated. We couldn't explain how perfect it was and how nice it was to just be skiing in bluebird weather, and you're making good progress, and instead of being in your own head trying to motivate yourself through a storm, you're skiing next to each other talking about what you would put on a hamburger, and it was just brilliant. So when the days were good, they were really good, but we had a lot of challenging weather as well.
Right. Now, one thought came up in that conversation there is human waste. I'm guessing you were carrying everything out, were you?
Just depends. Some of it it really depends on the regulations. For us, if we had to, we would. If we didn't have to, we wouldn't, because ultimately, it's not really a bacteria or a smell problem because it freezes really quickly, but it's more of a weight issue. So for us, if we had to carry it out, yeah, you would collect it and store it in your sled. But if you didn't need to, then you definitely wouldn't. You'd make sure it's buried properly. But yeah, it really just depends on where you are.
Right. Okay, so how accurate did your planning end up being? You sounded like you finished the trip quicker than you planned. It sounds like you had plenty of food. Was there anything that went really wrong with your planning, or was it was more a matter of fine tuning what you were doing?
Yeah, it was really about fine tuning what we were doing. We'd had a lot of training with an expert polar expedition company called Iceland in Norway, and that really helped us prepare. Along with other experiences that we had and kind of talking to each other and this whole process. But there's a few things that we definitely would change for next time and a few, silly mistakes that you don't think about until they happen. But most of it went quite well. And really it was a good experience for us to understand that we were on the right track and we had prepared properly, and also learn a lot about each other when you're going through an experience like that and knowing how you work together as a team. But for example, just little things like, my goggles fogged up and froze immediately because it was so cold. So I took them off for a couple of hours to let them air out, and I didn't bother to put my second pair on because I just wanted to get skiing as quickly as possible. But I ended up getting sunburn in my right eye. So, it was a pretty painful lesson of just take 1 minute and put your goggles on,
Yeah.
So little things like that. We lost a fair bit of weight because we were betting on the weight of our sleds, but it would have been nice to have a bit more food. And then, because we did finish quite early, the logistics of getting home ended up being a bit of a nightmare. But all in all, the ski part of the trip, we were quite happy with. It went quite well, and even with the challenge, it was good that we had challenging environments because we can look back and know that we handled it all really well, and it wasn't just because the weather was great or we had a lot of help. It was really just because we had prepared well and we were. And we worked well as a team as well. So the few things we changed to gear and technique is based on our experience there, but all in all, I think it was quite successful.
Okay. Now, what were the key challenges that you had to deal with? So obviously you were saying you would have preferred a bit more food, but that's always a hard thing to gauge. And you had the wins, but were there any other key challenges that you were either prepared for or weren't prepared for?
Yeah, I think it's not that we weren't prepared for them, but there were still challenges that you had to overcome. So the snow, for example, so Greenland changes quite a lot during the season, and we wanted to go as early as possible. Part of that was because we wanted more unstable and colder weather so that we could really put ourselves against it and test ourselves. And my brother was getting married in May, so I couldn't really miss his wedding when you're a groomsman. But
Yep.
So there was a few reasons, but going earlier meant that there was a lot more snow and the wind was not in your favour. And so the snow was quite a challenge, especially at the start. I think later on, when the snow melts or it hardens, it's a lot easier to ski on. So really just environmental challenges. It wasn't that it was unexpected, but it was definitely a big challenge. The navigation I found was actually a lot easier than I expected. But yeah, I'm just trying to think of things that were quite challenging. You know how it's always, you get that when you're looking back, it always seems rosy because you try to forget all the bad memories. But all in all, it was really quite good. I think, Iceland also provided us with weather updates during the journey, and they were pretty key to helping us understand what we'd be going through during the day. But the whiteouts were really hard to navigate, and there was a couple of days there where we just stopped early because the calculation between how much energy and stress you're putting yourself through versus how much progress you're making, there's a bit of a balance there. And so for us, it was better to stop and then the next day when the weather's better, we'd be able to make more progress than, fighting something which was just kind of getting us nowhere. So, yeah, I suppose there were challenging days, but nothing that really went horribly wrong. I think one of the benefits of going early, even though, the weather's not as good and the snow tends to be deeper, is the West Coast has a lot of frozen meltwater, and during the summer it unfreezes, obviously, and that creates this labyrinth of rivers that you need to cross, and some of them quite fast, quite dangerous, and the crevasses open up as well. So your requirements of your technical skills and the potential obstacles goes way up, and even so it's a bit of a trade-off because we didn't have any of that.
What about highlights? What were the, looking back on the trip, what did you really love about this trip?
Similar to the Australia trip, I think, and this is where I think it really relates to people of Australian hiker is really just extended time being away from it all. I don't know. I just find it's really good for your head, and it's really enjoyable. So for me, especially those good days where you weren't battling the cold and you weren't battling the wind and your own motivation to push through really poor weather, and it's just fun. It's just enjoyable, and it was a real adventure. And I think we really got a kick out of that, and just kind of being away from work and being away from technology and the news cycle, and it was quite peaceful, and that's a big motivator for all of these trips, is just being able to enjoy the moment and kind of be present. And then just being on such a big ski trip was fantastic. There was some good days where we had lots of energy and we just throw snowballs at each other, or it was just brilliant, really. One of the key highlights for me, if I had to say one, would be the last day, because the last day, it was basically like a holiday. It was 45 Ks, so it was our longest day, but it was a perfect weather day. Most of the trip was -20, it was -5. Most of the trip we had wind, there was no wind. A lot of the trip we had whiteouts. It was a bluebird day. We had like a 5 to 7 downhill gradient, so we could actually downhill ski, and then navigating an icefall onto a frozen fjord, skiing across a frozen fjord, and then being picked up by a local dog sledder and having dogs drive you back to the village. It's a very unique experience that I don't think really many people ever will get. And it was just this perfect ending to such a committing trip. So it's something I'll always remember.
Okay. Now, you mentioned social media before and getting check-ins. I mean, were you using satellite communications, or did the mobile phone system work on part of the trip?
No mobile phone service. So it's a mixture of both. So as part of your permitting, you're required to have a marine radio, a satellite phone, and a GPS, and a separate EPIRB. So it's a lot of equipment you have to take. They really are quite diligent in what they require you to take. So we had those three things. And through the GPS and the app on our phone, we communicated via text message. But we didn't invest in like an Iridium Go Exec or anything that had more bandwidth. So apart from our satellite phone and being able to text, that was pretty much all the communication we had. So we weren't accessing the internet, we weren't on social media, we weren't able to send images just because what we took didn't allow that. And so for 3 weeks, the only people we'd really talk to would be text messages to our handler who gave us the weather updates, or to our partners, or to some friends, basically. And then occasionally we'd call home on the satellite phone to say good day, and that was it.
Okay. Now, did you see any wildlife? I mean, I've got no idea what Greenland is like. Was there anything natural wandering around, or it's no wildlife at all?
Oh, a bit of both. So the ice cap has got zero wildlife. I mean, it's a massive ice cap, which means it's very cold, very high, and zero vegetation. The only thing that you may if you're unlucky, come across up there is a polar bear. It's quite rare because the polar bears are quite coastal because that's where their food is. But we did still have to take protection just in case we came across a hungry polar bear. We didn't see one, and so we saw literally nothing the entire crossing. But at the start and at the end on the coast, we got to see things. So at the start, particularly on the west coast, where there's a lot more green kind of areas before you get to the ice cap, we saw muskox and we saw reindeer and birds. It was really cool. And then nothing on the entire ice cap. And when we came back down, we saw some birds and dogs, but that was about it really. So yeah, it's really isolated to the coast, and there's quite an abundance of wildlife on the coast, but literally nothing on the entire ice cap.
Okay. Now, we last interviewed you in episode 231, which was almost 2 years ago or worked out, when you did the Tanami walk. And doing this walk was definitely a very different experience. If you had to rate them, did you have a preference between the two?
It's like asking me what my favourite child is.
Everyone's got a favourite child.
Yeah, exactly. To be honest, the Australian crossing, it still sticks with me. It still inspires me. I want to go back and do more. I just really love the outback and my experience crossing it. So, you know, Greenland was amazing, but when I was in Greenland, I was also thinking about the walk across Australia. So, yeah, I would say, and you know, it's they're all good in their own right, but yeah, the outback's definitely got a special place in my heart. So I'm looking forward to maybe doing more in the future if I'm able to.
All right. Yeah, I must admit I do. My favourite hike so far is Larapinta Trail, and I do love that Central Australian desert area. It's just something really special. So,
yeah, exactly.
All right. Now, one final question. I believe you've got another great adventure planned for the end of 2024. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the adventure for us. It's the reason we did Greenland. It's what I've been doing and working towards ever since I finished the Australia crossing for the last 3 years. It's no one's done it before, and the idea is to ski from the coast of Antarctica, 1,200 kilometres across the ice shelf to the base of the tallest mountain called Mount Vinson, and then climb Mount Vinson. And so our plan is to do a sea to summit of the tallest peak in Antarctica.
Okay. And now, is Mount Vincent, is it a mountain or is it just a big long slope?
No, it's not like Australia. It's a proper mountain. It's not a technical mountain, but it is a polar mountain. So it is quite serious in terms of weather and cold and crevasses, but you know, not technical climbing.
Yeah.
But it is a proper mountain. It's in the Ellsworth mountain range in East Antarctica, and so it's quite a technical and committing expedition. So as a part of this, you know, there's 1,200 kilometres of skiing, similar to what we did in Greenland, which was the whole purpose of going to Greenland, and then there's 400 kilometres of skiing through and around the mountain range, and then inserting yourself into the mountains where 4 glaciers converge, and then skiing up the main glacier to another glacier up onto base camp to climb the mountain. And so it's this combination of polar expeditions, polar mountaineering, and pretty raw adventure. So it's exciting.
So when's the plan start for that one? I think it was in November, I believe, from looking at your website.
Yeah, exactly. So the Antarctic season goes from November till March, or if you're interior Antarctica, it's more like the end of January, early Feb. So we're going to start as early as we can, which is the second week. The second week of Antarctica. So depending on weather, around the 10th of November is the plan at the moment.
And how many days have you planned for that one? Have you worked that one out yet?
Yeah, kind of. We're still refining it, but we're hoping to do it in 50 days. That would be our ideal for both the ski and the climb. So we should finish early to mid-January based on that.
Actually, just one question on that. How do you actually get back out again? Is it someone flies in and picks you up, or have you got to turn around and go back again?
No, so we'll get picked up from the base camp and flown out. So
Okay.
the mountain actually, there is the logistics company that's supporting our expedition. They support most of the logistics for that part of Antarctica. And so it's quite common for them to fly people to climb the mountain itself. And then also they support most of the South Pole expeditions. And so as such, we'll be able to fly into their main base in Antarctica and then get a smaller plane out to one of their camps that they have established near the coastline. And then we'll be picked up at the base of the mountain to fly home after we've done the climb.
Now, is that trip entirely in Australian territory, or are you crossing over a few different countries' territories?
Yeah, so it's not in Australian territory. It's in the Australian territory. Funny enough, if people don't know, Australian territory is about 40% of Antarctica.
Yep.
I'd encourage you to look into the history. It's quite amazing, especially with Douglas Mawson. But that territory sits under Australia. So we'll be going, I believe it's through the Chilean and British territories. But in terms of like sovereignty and bureaucracy, the Antarctic Treaty basically dictates that nobody can isolate their own territories or lay actual claim to it. So it's a lot less bureaucratic than Greenland was.
Okay. All right. That's cool.
Yep.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing about that one and seeing how that trip goes.
Yeah, looking forward to it. So we're 4.5 months out now, so it's becoming very real, and every day we're doing something to do the final preparations. So yeah, it's getting quite exciting.
Okay, so we've been talking with James McAlloon about his trip across Greenland. James, thanks so very much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Thanks so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure to keep you updated with what I'm doing when I'm not at work.
So that was our interview with James McAlloon on his Greenland crossing. And I think from my perspective, I mean, you can't really class this as a hike, I'll be honest about that, but you can best class James and his partner Henk as adventurers. And while they've done some pretty good hiking trips, and we did interview James in episode 231, Crossing the Tanami Desert, on a 1,745 kilometre portion of his Crossing Australian trip. I think that certainly this is something that's really interesting, and I've been interesting to follow over the last couple of years, and particularly as we mentioned, this trip is a warm-up trip to their Antarctic trip, which is going to be held in November of 2024. So looking forward to hearing more about that one as well.
Yeah, they're definitely adventurers, and they obviously get on pretty well. There was some challenges and no doubt some very tense moments when he was talking about the weather conditions and just the amount of time it took. I think he mentioned, a long time to boil the water. So you can put the tent up in 10 minutes, but then you have to spend so much time. Patience, the isolation, just personally challenging in so many different ways.
Now, I knew very little about Greenland. I know roughly where it is. I know it's got a lot of ice.
I'm going to ask you to point to it on a map in a minute.
But that was about the extent of it. So there was a couple of interesting things that were raised. I mean, you tend to assume that there's one traditional crossing method or a crossing location, and really James said there's pretty much pick where you want. And their crossing was one of the narrower options, but it was still 600 kilometres. And by the sound of it, you tend to expect Greenland to be flat. But it is flat up on top, or flattish. But you're virtually up on almost like a table plateau, making your way up, reaching the peak, and then all of a sudden starting your descent back down again. Although he said that the change in altitude was so minor, you were really hard to tell what you were actually doing, and no real benefit with going up or going down. Logistics sounded like a real, that was probably the most difficult thing of this whole trip. I can understand the government wanting to make sure that they're not responsible for rescuing people and paying to rescue people. So the whole process of having to have multiple pieces of equipment, having a satellite phone, having a personal locator beacon, having all sorts of other equipment like a marine radio, just to cover yourself in all eventualities.
Well, really, they're things that you need so you can be found. So presumably you can't guarantee that you're never going to need help, but certainly with all those pieces of equipment, they can locate them.
Yeah, and I assume if one doesn't work, certainly one of the others certainly will. So it's quite good there. Now, if you go onto the show notes for this episode, there's a series of photos that James provided, and this was really a ski trip, and they were towing sleds. And it's as James said, it's a bit of a compromise. You want to have enough food, because if you do run out of food, that's the end of the trip. But you don't want to have so much that you're having to tow it and carry it, which is going to slow you down and cause other problems. So it's a fine line between what do we actually need. And I think they were saying they planned on a 25-day trip. They took 28 days of food, and that covered them just in case. And it's not as if you can say, oh, look, yeah, we're going to finish this early, we'll eat extra. You just don't know what's going to happen. You could get caught, or you could end up stopping somewhere because the whiteouts which they had was so bad, they just ended up parking themselves for a day or two. So it's very much a logistic planning exercise, and I think it's very much a different sort of trip. In fact, you're skiing and towing sleds, be quite an interesting process. Rather than carrying packs on your backs, you're physically towing everything behind you. Some of the challenges that James mentioned was 170 kilometre-hour winds. So, I don't think you're going to be moving very far on that one. It's sort of find somewhere you can hide and get into some shelter out of the wind and just park yourself, because you're not going to be making any headway if you're trying to walk or ski in that sort of conditions. But it did sound like the weather varied from being perfectly clear and spectacular days to having whiteouts and being really strong winds. So that's not unexpected, particularly in an area where there's no large objects to block any of the winds out.
And also the whiteouts just present such a big challenge. When you've got that kind of landscape, I would imagine pretty much you're stuck with, either going very, very slowly or just stopping, because you can't really work out where you're going, which direction.
One of the other considerations I hadn't thought about either was polar bears. Yes, I expect polar bears to be in the Arctic Circle, but for some reason, I just didn't associate them with Greenland. And while
I'm really going to get you to point to Greenland on the map.
And while he did say that they typically tend to, if they're there, they tend to be more around the coastline where their food is, it certainly wasn't something he wanted to come across in the middle of a trip when you've got nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. He did mention that they had to take precautions in the unlikely event they did come across a polar bear, but it was a consideration. So, worst we have to worry about here is probably snakes. In America, you get bears. I don't think I'd really want to come across a polar bear if I could help it.
No.
Now, as James mentioned, this was a lead-in trip to their Antarctic trip, which starts in 2024 in November. So this is approximately 1,200 kilometres from the coastline over 50 approximate days to reach the top of the highest mountain in Antarctica. So this is a sea to summit trip. And it's not something that many people are likely to do. And certainly I'm looking forward to catching up with James after that trip in sort of February, March next year, just to see how he actually went on it.
Yeah, he might need a bit of a rest after that one.
But as we said, have a look at the images on the show notes. They've got images of both James and his partner Henk. They've got images of them towing gear. The fact that in most of their trip it was pretty much daylight just about all the whole trip. In the earlier parts of the trip, They said they had a couple of hours a day where the sun was just dipping below the horizon, but it was only just, so it was never really dark as such. And I think that would be a really hard thing to try and cope with. For me, if it's light, I want to keep on walking. But when you've got light for 20, 22 odd hours a day, you're really going to have to force yourself to say, right, I can't walk for that long. I've got to stop and have a break and work out what time of the day it actually is, because that must be a very hard thing to try and gauge. And
just in that, I mean, he was saying that they were, starting off early, and, I think he mentioned around 6 o'clock was when they would finish for the day. That's a pretty long day, pretty exhausting day. When the weather's beautiful, it's probably not so bad, but if they've been struggling against those heavy winds, that would have been, pretty tough and pretty tiring.
Okay, we hope you've enjoyed listening to James talking about his Greenland adventure and his upcoming Antarctic adventure. We will, as I said, try and catch back up with them again after their trip in early 2025. That's all for this episode. Bye for now.
And bye from me.